let us consider power. Power, in any form that we can attain, is limited by mortal constraints and needs to be generated through some sort of effort on our part. Political power is limited to our reach, our sphere of influence, and generated through promises and threats. Personal power over ourselves is obviously limited to ourselves and is generated primarily through an objective fear. We exercise and diet because we fear infirmity and death. We educate because we fear ignorance. You get the idea. Magical power goes above beyond normal limitations, but still has limits. We can build a cart with our hands over days or weeks, but with a spell we could do it instantly, but we can't will one into existence without the base materials at hand. Spells and supernatural abilities bring us to a higher level of power and finesse in many areas, though we've all heard tales of mere fighters and scoundrels who deal death to the greatest monsters of the world through only blood and sweat. The point is, power has limits, because we have limits. From the first to the fifth age, these limits have changed in definition and scope, but there was always an end point, a moment from which what was improbable became impossible. In the second age, there were the beings called Titans that could do the impossible. We're not going to talk about them much, but let me give you a few examples of titanic power. Celia, a Titan associated with love, could remove any negative feelings from any being except for deities and powers, be it hatred, unhappiness, depression. She couldn't remove it permanently, only for a day or so, but she stopped entire armies, entire wars, by removing the key emotions from all the combatants at once that banished logic and fled conflict. Algorn, a Titan with influence over the seas, could create water on a scale far above any mortal, up to the size of an average lake. An average lake is about 300 hectares of water, and assuming a minimum depth of 1 foot, that is 914 million litres of water at least. Gerzon, a Titan holding the influence of death, could immediately and instantly kill any living being, regardless of location, regardless of protection. It should be noted that this ability was never utilized without the express permission and authority of a deity. The reason that I'm talking about the Titans is because you can imagine the gulf of power differential between a human and a powerful mage like Elminster. You can imagine that gulf between Elminster, who would run out of spells eventually, and a Titan whose only limitation was their service to a deity. That same immeasurable gulf exists between Titans, or anyone, and the gods. And it is the gods that we'll be talking about today. A good place to start with a god is its creation. In the beginning, it is said that Lord Ao created the crystal sphere of realm space and the first gods of our material plane. He created the divine mechanism, an intangible contract or process by which divine rank of the gods is measured via worship, which keeps the powers of the gods in ever-fluctuating balance without his direct interference, with rules and calculations unknown to the gods, therefore unknown to us. It accounts for the worship of followers devoted to only one deity, and the more casual worship of the average inhabitant of the realms for several or many powers. It may be influenced temporarily by the use of powerful worship ceremonies or artifacts, but such spiking of the system must be reinforced by stable, long-term worship, or the quickly gained power leeches away within a few months to a year. The mechanism is totally transparent to mortals, and while the powers can guess roughly how it works, they cannot discern its precise nature or its quirks as to explain any divine loopholes. A god is created around worship, but worship must be focused in order for it to be useful, and with so many other gods competing, gods quickly became associated with a particular aspect of mortal life. Since the dawn of history, every culture has strived to explain the mysteries of the world in terms that people can understand, and people have always tried to influence their fates by appealing to the wondrous forces that shape their lives. In almost every case, these forces have been given names, shapes, and personalities which people could, at least to some small degree, comprehend. In addition, magical powers have been attributed to those forces. To gain the favour of these supernatural beings, the people who created them began offering them gifts of food, wealth, and even life itself. The nature of a society's god is both a reflection and a catalyst of its culture. The pantheon embodies its worldview, greatly influencing what the characters in that society desire, how they behave, and their motivations for undertaking heroic deeds. What we see of the gods is like a graphical user interface. It's an aspect of a greater power made simple so that we can comprehend it. When I see a statue of Suni, I understand her beauty or love, but I could never understand the function or mechanism behind the entity behind what I see. In much the same way that we can trace formic acid on the ground to make ants follow it, so too do the gods trace personality, promises, and glory on our material plane so that we will follow them. The gods truly are what we make them, because the truth of power behind the mask would cause us to lose our minds. And our minds really function holistically. We can't look at the reality of the material plane and comprehend fully how it's a singular machine of cause and effect, each piece part of a greater calculation that enforces the choices we think we're making freely. No, instead we look at a tree and think it independent of the shadow it casts. We see a war and see the death that follows it. We see chaos versus law, time versus stasis, and everywhere we could see something more easily as a part rather than the sum. There is a god. If you're on a ship and you don't want a storm to sink you, Talos can help you if you pray to him, or Umberlee might listen if you pray to her. Just don't annoy them, or they will crush you as easily as you would the ant that bites your leg. A god cannot die, not easily, and often not permanently. Take a Monitor as an example. He was a greater entity of the pantheon in ancient Netheril. His abilities allowed him to discern and judge mortals with a glance, identifying thieves and lawbreakers. He could shoot flame strikes and sunbeams from his eyes. He had immunity to light, fire, illusions and phantasms, cold, shadow and darkness, fear and mind control magic. He could banish darkness with a thought, create sunlight in a 10-mile diameter, and had a cadre of chosen mortals who possessed powers of light and invigoration. He often appeared in avatar form as a man, but had a female persona whose scale decorations could let a mortal see their pronounced future. And he could also manifest as 13 giant hyena to rip apart offenders whose victims lacked the ability to get their own justice. The avatars of a Monitor were powerful but could possibly be killed. However, the energy of the avatar and all items it carried would almost instantly be transported back to the deity, whose power and form still resided within his realm, the keep of the eternal sun within Mechanus. You see, the deity himself could not be killed save by another deity of greater status, or a god of a lesser status wielding the correct artifact. No mortal could ever kill a god. If that mortal wielded the same correct artifact, it would have been possible to drive off or weaken them, but the god will always recover. Sending a mortal to kill a god is a complicated death sentence for them. Most gods could, with only a thought, instantly strip the individual of their death immunity magic and kill them, especially within their own demiplane. But let's say that the mortal held an artifact that also negated that ability. A real god could usually only be found within their demiplane and never sending their true forms to Faerun, only avatars with a fragment of their consciousness. So the would-be godslayer would have to travel to their demiplane, which is usually hidden from mortal sight and reliable ways of planar travel. Many of the gods employ defenses that prevent someone from entering without asking permission. And speaking about asking, that was a risk in and of itself. Like the above, a Monitor could judge the worthiness of a soul with a look. Mistral knew every spell as it was being cast and could judge the purpose of each and every one, cancel any spell she did not want to have cast, at once, all the time. Any god of sufficient strength could hear their name being spoken by any mortal and know that mortal's identity if they were a worshipper, and the reason for uttering their name. And code words often didn't work, as calling a monitor the yellow god was still an evocation of that god. It's hard for mortals to engage in more than 2 conversations at once. A god could follow the thread and purpose of hundreds of thousands of conversations at once. And that's not including petitions, prayers for spells, and answering questions from spells such as communion. This goes beyond just having a higher intellect. It's a way of interacting with the world that transcends anything we could ever experience. These beings are practically omniscient. They always know what is happening on the entire plane they inhabit, and the planes any of their allies, worshippers, or holy objects are currently on. They also know what is happening on the plane that anyone or anything speaks one of their names or titles is on for a year after the name is spoken. In many cases, they can accurately predict the precise actions of mortals and other deities based on their vast knowledge. Unfortunately, this sensing ability can be blocked by the conscious effort of powers of equal stature. Back to a monitor and his example of being immune to death as we know it. He could not be killed save by a more powerful god. He could recover from any wound delivered by a mortal, but he died nonetheless by the powerful third point. Gods require worship. It's not just vanity or glory or an ephemeral desire, it is raw and necessary existence to a god. See, when Netheril fell, it was a widely held belief that a monitor could have stopped the calamity. His sphere of influence was law. To break the law was to destroy the civilization. And so people believed that since civilization had indeed been pretty darn destroyed, a monitor should have stepped in to stop Karsus, and didn't. And they were right. It's understood that a monitor could have stepped in but did not, because to do so would have overstepped his portfolio. It would have broken the divine contract that magic was the domain of Mistral. His adherence? No. His lawful design made him unable to intercede. The people denounced him, his temples were destroyed, worship of a monitor dwindled to near nothing. Worship creates notice, veneration is an emotive force born by fear or love. This energy flows to a god and is used by them in much the same way we require air or food. Worship of a god is their source of power, but also their greatness weakness, because as soon as it disappears, a monitor dropped in power and rank, from greater to lesser over the next millennium. A god's power is only as great as how well they are known, their identity linked to the shared identity in the minds of mortals. As temples and churches were rebuilt, as the faithful dwindled, as the books no longer spoke of a monitor, so too did his power fade, until one day it faltered. There's a story of a different god, a god of death known as Anubis. Once, long ago, this god noticed a realm of dead entities, ancient and old powers tumbling in a forgotten part of the astral sea. Those were the bodies of the dead gods, those whose time and fires had burned out long ago and now were merely insensate husks, capable of reaching out into the world as vestiges but no more. Even in death, gods do not often die, perhaps because you could never quench their belief in themselves. And Anubis saw these forgotten beings who surely at some point must have been powerful and world-changing, but now were just astral flotsam. And at that point he split. The majority of a new form retained his old powers and a new consciousness, but the mind which had come to an epiphany raced into the astral doldrums with a new body and a new purpose. He became the caretaker for these ancient dead beings, and it is here that a monitor perhaps now resided. Belief continued in small groups for a monitor, with a sect of clerics learning the art known as Servant of the Fallen, which allowed for a dead god to grant spells through something akin to deific legacy. And the more radical aspects of that church believed that a monitor was not truly dead, but had in fact either reincarnated as the Morning Lord Lathander, a new world god, or perhaps was merely one aspect of the sun itself, with the sun being an overgod with many viable avatars through which to channel worship. Either way, it was believed that a Monitor would return once more. A Monitor's return was heralded by a fire genasi named Delagoth Aundir. The man was a believer in the aforementioned heresy and made it his goal to make it the mainstream branch of Lathander's church. He strengthened his base and power in intra-church politics, developed a Monitor's Eternal Sun spell, and managed to get hold of the Shard of the Sun, a holy relic to a Monitor. He even claimed he had seen visions that a Monitor's ascension was nigh, and gathered his people to Elversalt to witness the sign of ascension in 1374 DR. The sign he referred to were the effects of a Monitor's Eternal Sun spell, which he developed beforehand. This made people believe him, and people flocked to the Church of Lathander to join the Church of a Monitor, while the leaders of Lathander's church were not sure what to do. It was a heresy, sure, but it also brought new belief, stronger belief, to Lathander. Lathander was revealed to be a Monitor in the Year of Blue Fire, 1385 DR, just after the Spell Plague, which definitely happened. It was not clear whether it was the truth or if he embraced the heresy and turned it into effective truth. After the Spell Plague definitely happened, a Monitor became an established greater deity of the Faerunian pantheon. He fulfilled the role of timekeeper amongst the gods. He had people who primarily worshipped him as Lathander, his youthful aspect, something a Monitor actively encouraged. The reinstatement was performed by Lord Ao, the only entity who can decide who will become a god and who will not. He can return gods to life from death, ascend mortals to godhood, and decides if a deity from another reality can gain a foothold here in realm space. Presumably other realities have an entity similar to Lord Ao, though perhaps they're more circumspect in their appearances, because the others have never reported such a being's existence. But the rules of divine mechanism and supplantation exist there also. Finally, let's list a few things that the greater deities can do to really wrap your mind around the entities we're dealing with. Greater gods can transform themselves into any object, animate or inanimate, of any size. In some cases, beings of this stature have been known to assume planetary proportions. Just as they can teleport across space without error, so too can they travel between the various planes of existence at will. These powerful beings cannot, however, travel to the prime material plane. It's too much of a guarded place, primarily by Lord Ao, but also from the other gods themselves. Greater powers can create any object, animate or inanimate, they can think of. The process is draining, however, since they are converting their own energy stores into physical objects, but generally a castle could be created and then about 100 minutes of recharging is needed. Greater powers can kill any living mortal creature with but a thought. Likewise, they can bestow life upon any slain mortal being anywhere. Of course, another greater god can reverse this effect immediately, if so desired. Greater powers can employ up to 10 avatars at a time, moving them between planes at will. If one is destroyed, they require 1 day to make another. And it is avatars that we'll be talking about next time. By no means to be taken lightly, avatars are the physical manifestation of a god converted to be within mortal limitations. They are vehicles of a god's wishes and judgment, able to converse with mortals on their level, able to fight, able to die. We will be looking at a few example avatars from the previous ages, including the Mulhorandi gods and their limitations, unique to those gods. We'll be looking at the modern avatars, avatars from other spheres of existence, and the unique abilities of avatars from the time of troubles. Until then, to be continued.